So here after wildcard weekend, a lot of teams have been eliminated from the NFL playoffs, including 18 teams that didn't even make the playoffs to begin with. And today I want to talk about the 2025 NFL offseason. And I want to give you guys 20 big names that could be on the move and get traded this upcoming offseason. So obviously it's a lot harder to make a trade in the NFL when you take into account dead cap and cap hits. It's not as likely as a trade throughout the MLB or the NBA, but all these names have been rumored in deals either throughout the regular season and maybe in this upcoming offseason, and it could make sense for these teams' directions going forward. We've seen big trades in the past like Deshaun Watson to the Cleveland Browns, Tyreek Hill to the Miami Dolphins. So yeah, today I'm gonna give you guys 20 names that could be on the move this offseason. Let me know if you agree or disagree with any of these down below. Drop a thumbs up if you guys do enjoy these style videos, and hit that subscribe button if you're not already. A ton of you guys are not subscribed. Let's get into it. First name I want to talk to you guys with is Myles Garrett of the Cleveland Browns. This one has been brought up throughout the regular season for, I think, the first time since Myles Garrett was pretty much that #1 overall pick of the 2017 NFL draft. He's 29 years old now. He's in the middle of his prime and is one of the best edge rushers and just one of the best overall defenders in the National Football League. And he's come out and said, I don't want to get traded right now, but if this team does not build a winning roster soon, I could want out. And looking at everything on this Browns roster right now, I don't see how they become a contender throughout this offseason just because they have Deshaun Watson's massive cap hit on the table. He may miss all of next year's season because of that Achilles injury. So Myles Garrett could want out. And honestly, for Cleveland, they may need to hit the reset button, and you'd probably get 2 first-round picks for Myles Garrett, similar to what the Oakland Raiders got at the time when they traded away Khalil Mack, and they can use that as a reference point in trade negotiations. Myles Garrett, like I said, has been one of the best defensive players in the NFL since he got drafted #1 overall, including making one here in 2024. He does have 6 Pro Bowl appearances, and he won Defensive Player of the Year in 2023. He has 102 career sacks throughout 117 games and hasn't really been on a winning roster for most of his career. He did have that playoff win with Baker Mayfield on those 2020 Browns teams, and he went to the playoffs last year with Joe Flacco and the Cleveland Browns. But like I said, it is not exciting going forward with this team. Kevin Stefanski is still the head coach, and it looks like Cleveland could be making some big decisions this offseason. And who knows, if a team comes on the table, gives 2 first-round picks for Myles Garrett, it may be tough to say no to that because he is still one of the premier defensive players in the NFL. Next up, I want to talk about somebody that's probably likely to get traded this offseason because he publicly stated that he wants to get traded after their Week 18 loss against the Jets, and that is Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins, who was traded to Miami just a couple years ago. Tyreek Hill is 30 years old. He was elite in Miami his first 2 years there in 2022 and in 2023. He led the NFL in receiving touchdowns last year and receiving yards with just 1 yard fewer than 1,800. This year was just a disaster for the Miami Dolphins. It was a disappointing year for the offense as a whole. For Chris Greer, the GM, Mike McDaniel, the head coach, Tua was hurt, and it seemed like Gino Smith was the wide receiver one through the team throughout the year. Their tight end that didn't have super high expectations going into this season, and Tyreek Hill says he basically wants out, so this is pretty much a given. And I would say he's one of the more likely players that I'm going to talk about in this video that's actually going to get traded. Tyreek Hill has a cap hit of $28 million next year. $56 million in dead cap. There's a potential out after the 2026 season where that dead cap drops significantly, but the cap hit increases a ton. So there's definitely some risk in trading for Tyreek Hill. And I think just based off this year, he's now on the wrong side of 30, and that massive cap hit next year, I think it's less likely that Tyreek Hill will go for the amount that Miami paid for him a couple years ago, where the main piece coming back was a first-round pick in that 2022 draft, and then also a second-round pick and a couple day 3 picks. And I think honestly this would be best for Miami. They have a lot of money tied up to this team right now. Jalen Waddle has been disappointing since he got that extension from them, but he could still be a good receiver in this league. You want to bring back Gino Smith. You hope to get a little bit more healthy defensively next year, and then you hope if Tua is actually healthy in the 2025 season, you could perform better than you were this year because they still had a chance of making the playoffs. If they won Week 18 and Denver lost, they would have been in, even with Tua missing all these games this season. So I think they'd be fine if they traded away Tyreek Hill, and that'd probably be the right decision for them. The next player we're going to talk about may have an asterisk on it just because there's probably a better chance that he's going to get cut than traded, which is just insane for the amount of money he signed just last offseason, and that is Kirk Cousins of the Atlanta Falcons. Yeah, Kirk Cousins signed that 4-year, $180 million deal with Atlanta. It included a $50 million signing bonus and $100 million guaranteed. And yes, this contract was signed specifically in a way that could have an out after the 2026 season, where the dead cap drops from $65 million in 2025 to just $25 million in 2026. But I'm sure Atlanta even knowing that there's a chance they could have cut him or traded him after next year's season, did not think that was going to happen in year number 1. And Michael Penix did play with some optimism over the final weeks of the season. They drafted him in the top 10 in the 2024 NFL draft. They're giving the keys to Michael Penix. So there's probably a good chance that Kirk Cousins gets cut, then traded, and this could be like a Russell Wilson situation from last offseason. I'm sure there's going to be a ton of teams that want to go after Kirk Cousins because he's 36 years old. Maybe they're going to look at this year. It was the first year basically off that major Achilles tear, and he's going to be much better next year when he's a little bit more healthier and has a little bit less rust on his game as well, because he had some good games this year, but he did also have some bad games, and maybe that's more on like the Zach Robinson, Raheem Morris offense in Atlanta, and maybe a team like San Francisco or like Cleveland thinks they can still get a couple more good years out of Kirk Cousins. It's definitely a possibility, but I think it's more likely of a chance that Kirk Cousins is on a different team next year than the Atlanta Falcons. And let's just stick on the topic of very old quarterbacks that may be washed in this league. Aaron Rodgers. I think if he does want to play football again, it's not going to be for the New York Jets. That just can't happen after much of a disaster it was for the Jets this year, as Joe Douglas, the GM, gets fired. Robert Saleh, the head coach, gets fired in the middle of the year. Aaron Rodgers kind of forces the team to trade for Devonte Adams, and he's 41 years old. Now, the counting numbers this year, not terrible. 3,800 passing yards, 28 touchdowns, and 11 interceptions. And I still think Aaron Rodgers could be a top 20, top 22 quarterback in this league, and maybe even better with the right system around him, because the Jets offensive line, I think, was better this year than expected, but Breece Hall wasn't great. There was up and down play from just kind of everybody on the Jets team, and it was a disaster. Rodgers went 5-12 this year and played every game, but honestly, I do think a team would take a chance on him. We'll see if the Jets just outright cut him, or if he ends up getting traded, if he does want to come back for his age 41 season, because I think a team like San Fran, I don't know, there's the Kyle Shanahan, Aaron Rodgers connection that has been there, publicly stated in the past. There could be a team maybe like the Las Vegas Raiders that aren't going to get one in the draft. They could look at giving Aaron Rodgers just like a 1-year deal, and he can go out on a high note with Tom Brady as his boss. So I think there's a lot of different scenarios that can happen with Aaron Rodgers this year, and we've just seen how volatile quarterback play is. And with the free agency class being not that great, with Sam Darnold really being the top name out there, and then you have like Russell Wilson and Justin Fields and those guys as well, the draft isn't looking that deep either. Guys at the top, you have Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward, but are you really going to trust Jackson Dart or Jalen Milroe or Dylan Gabriel to be your starting quarterback week 1 next year? I'm not too sure. So I think there'd be a robust market for Aaron Rodgers if he does get cut or traded by the Jets. Here's another one that's similar to the Myles Garrett discussion that I leaded off this video with, and that is Max Crosby of the Las Vegas Raiders, because this one came up this year throughout the middle of the season. Max Crosby is 27 years old, and like Myles Garrett, is one of the premier edge rushers in the NFL and is just one of the best defensive players overall. He's got 2 All-Pro second team honors already in his career. He's got a couple Defensive Player of the Year finishes, hasn't won that award yet. He's got 4 straight Pro Bowls, including getting one this year where he only played 12 games, but over the last 3 years, he's got 12.5 sacks in 2022, 14.5 sacks in 2023, and he has 7.5 sacks this year in just 12 games played. The Las Vegas Raiders weren't great this year, and Max Crosby is at the start of his prime at 27 years old, and it is a shame he had a season-ending injury. This contract, though, he's under contract basically throughout the 25 season and the 2026 season, and comparable to what guys are getting around the league, you know, at making $27 million throughout the next 2 years isn't terrible, because it has a base salary of $22 million in the 25 season and $18 million in the 2026 season. And since he's 27 years old, I know he's not as good as Myles Garrett, but I do think that he can get 2 first-round picks on the open market or close to that, just because of how valuable these elite edge rushers can be. And I think Vegas could realize where they are right now. They may not get their franchise quarterback this offseason. They could look to hit a little bit of a reset button and then try to be bad in 2026, take a quarterback there. And honestly, I think getting 2 first-round picks, if it's on the table, isn't the worst idea if you're not going to be competing throughout the next couple of years while Max Crosby is in his prime. All right, here's the next one, and this is coming from a Steelers fan, basically. Could we see a massive Pittsburgh Steelers trade this offseason? Could that come with coaching or with players? Because they just got embarrassed once again in the playoffs by the Baltimore Ravens. They didn't really put up a fight. The final score was 28-14. It looks so much worse than that. In the past, they've gone blown out by the Chiefs, blown out by the Bills. This team hasn't won a playoff game in almost a decade. It's been a while, and those playoff wins were against Alex Smith of the Chiefs, Matt Moore of the Dolphins, AJ McCarron of the Cincinnati Bengals, and they definitely should have lost that game. It's been a minute, and it may be time for the Steelers to go in a different direction. So could they trade Mike Tomlin, who's one of the most respected head coaches in the NFL? He's been with the Steelers for almost 20 years now. He does have a Super Bowl under his belt, but he hasn't been able to win a playoff game in quite some time. And the Steelers have had some embarrassing playoff losses. He's never really had a coordinator that's went on and got a different job that he's pretty much groomed and came from his coaching tree. And the coordinators right now, like, I don't mind Arthur Smith, but Terrell Austin, probably you can use an upgrade as your defensive coordinator. Could the Steelers realize where they are right now and trade Mike Tomlin? Like, that'd be a massive trade. We saw Sean Payton go for a first-round pick to the Broncos when he came out of retirement a couple years ago. The Steelers could probably get a first-round pick for Mike Tomlin, but I think that's unrealistic just because the Steelers are very patient as a franchise and the Rooneys don't really want to trade Tomlin, it seems. So could the Steelers go in a different direction and trade one of their top players? Could they look to see the market for TJ Watt? I know it sounds crazy, but you're just not going to compete in the AFC with Russell Wilson or with any other quarterback that you can get this offseason against Mahomes, Allen, Burrow if they're back in the playoffs, or Lamar Jackson, who just embarrassed you once again here. And I think the Steelers could get a haul for TJ Watt. Yeah, I know he had a down year to his incredibly high standards, but he'd go for what I talked about Max Crosby going for and Myles Garrett earlier in the video. He's still in his prime as an edge rusher. I think you got to think about it if it's on the table for the Steelers. I know it's a shame, but do you want to go 9-8 every year, 10-7 every year? You allow Tomlin to never have that under 500 season, sure, but then you get bounced in round 1 and your draft pick isn't good enough to take one of these franchise-changing quarterbacks at the top of the draft. I think it's the worst spot to be in. This is a little bit of a rant coming from a Steelers fan. I honestly don't hate the idea now. I'd rather see them trade Cameron Hayward, who you're probably not getting a first-round pick for, but he was an All-Pro this year, and I think could still get you a nice return. And I just really want to see Cam Hayward compete for a championship. He didn't win one with the Steelers because he got drafted in 2011, a couple years after they beat Arizona, and I still think he's one of the more underrated players in the NFL. I'd love to see him retire in a Steelers jersey, but I kind of want to see him get a ring. So could the Steelers look to move Mike Tomlin? Could it be more of a big player trade like Cameron Hayward, like Minkah Fitzpatrick, or TJ Watt? I think that's definitely on the table because I think the Steelers are hopefully realizing that they're just in purgatory right now. But I think a more realistic Steelers trade, I'll have this as another entry, is going to be George Pickens. Yeah, they're wide receiver 1 right now. And the Steelers skill position players are some of the worst in the NFL. That's why I'm not going to put this too much on Russell Wilson or Arthur Smith this season, because your top receivers are George Pickens, Mike Williams, Van Jefferson, Ben Skoranek, Scotty Miller, who ended up not making it to the end of the season at times, and obviously Calvin Austin, the 5'9", 5'8" receiver that they threw to triple coverage in the end zone in their final play basically of the season. But back to George Pickens, he's a free agent at the end of next year. He was a second-round pick, so he doesn't have that fifth-year option, and he may want a new extension this summer, and I just think that would be crazy to give him that, because while Pickens has been one of your best receivers since you drafted him, it was him and Deontay Johnson. You trade Deontay, you go all in on Pickens, who's immensely talented. He's one of the more talented receivers in the NFL. Is he one of the best? No, he's 23 years old. He had 900 yards this year with definitely higher expectations. He did miss a little bit. He can make some crazy plays, man. He really can. He's an elite route runner. He's an elite deep ball threat. But you're coming with a lot of baggage because sometimes he's a hothead on the field. He gets a ton of unsportsmanlike conduct penalties, and it just feels like he's not maybe the greatest locker room presence in the world. And I think if there's a market for George Pickens, I think you should capitalize on it. And honestly, this is just coming for a Steelers fan for the last 2 nominations. I'd rather them just enter a rebuild, hit the reset button, be bad next year, and then maybe Arch Manning will save the franchise. Next player I want to talk about is for a team that has to shed a ton of money this offseason to be cap compliant for the 2025 season. We're going to talk about Derek Carr right now. Derek Carr just finished up his second year in New Orleans. Last year, they went 9-8. It wasn't the best year for Derek Carr there as they missed out on the playoffs, and I think he was probably the most hated man in New Orleans, up there with Zion Williamson at one point. And this year got off to a great start. The Saints looked like one of the best teams and one of the best offenses in the league after 2 games, and then they just came back down to earth. Carr this year missed a bunch of time. He missed 7 games. He finished with a 5-5 record. He threw for 15 touchdowns and 5 interceptions. He's still just 33 years old, which isn't super old for a veteran quarterback in this league, but he does have a $51 million cap hit for the 2025 season. $50 million in dead cap, $61 million cap hit next year. It's a $30 million base salary in 2025, $40 million base salary in 2026, which isn't absurd for a quarterback, a little bit absurd for Carr's talent, but maybe that could be appealing for a team out there that is looking for a bridge quarterback. Maybe somebody drafts Jalen Milroe or Shedeur Sanders, and they'd rather let them sit for a little bit and have Derek Carr be that bridge quarterback, because the Saints most likely have to move on from him. I think another likely trade candidate of the New Orleans Saints has to be Tyron Matthew, who's a free agent at the end of the 2025 season. So he only has 1 year left on his deal. It's about $6 million in a base salary, $11 million cap hit. They take $13 million in dead cap. Matthew is 32 years old. He's going to be 33 at the start of next year's season. He's still a productive secondary player in this league, as you could play him kind of all over the secondary as well, and that could be appealing to some teams that are looking for probably a cheap upgrade there because of what Marshawn Lattimore went for at the trade deadline. I think Matthew would go for around the same thing, probably even less this offseason, just because of their age differences, and that would free up a little bit of money for the Saints. So I think this is one of the more likely players that gets traded this offseason as well. And I wanted to include one more skill position Saint, because I do think we're going to see a ton of moves from them this offseason. They may look to cut some of their veterans as well, but could they move either Alvin Kamara or Chris Olave? Now, Kamara just signed an extension a little bit as of late, and obviously he's been there longer than Olave, but he would go for a lot less on the market. We saw Joe Mixon go for a 7th round pick last offseason. I don't think we'd see Kamara go for that much. I think a little bit more than what Joe Mixon went for, but I'm actually going to talk about Chris Olave, who's had just a plethora of concussions over the last few years in this league, and maybe that's from some hospital balls from Saints quarterbacks throwing him in bad positions on the field, and maybe he just wants to be in a different environment. He's going to be a free agent at the end of the 2026 season because he does have that 5th-year option, and I'd like to think that they are going to pick that up because when he's healthy, he's still one of the better wide receivers in this league. Is he a top 5 receiver? No. Is he a top 10 receiver? Probably not, but top 20 receiver, you could definitely say that, and I think he's talented enough to be a wide receiver 1. It's just a shame concussions have been a big part of his career, but the Saints, I think they're entering into a rebuild, and a much needed rebuild in that. I think there's no point in having Chris Olave on your roster unless you want him to be that safety blanket for maybe your eventual franchise quarterback if they look to draft one this year or find one over the course of time. But I think it would be wise to probably look at the trade market for Chris Olave if you can get a good return, because I feel like teams would be lining up to trade for Olave, and he may want out of New Orleans. Let's talk about some other receivers here. Devonte Adams of the New York Jets. I feel like if Aaron Rodgers gets cut or traded, Devonte Adams should be out of the door as well. I wouldn't mind actually keeping Devonte Adams if you go for a different quarterback this offseason, because him and Garrett Wilson, that's a really good duo still, even in the year 2025 with Adams getting up there in age. He does have a $35 million base salary for this upcoming season, so it's massive. You take a huge cap hit if you do trade him, $38 million, but only $8 million in dead cap. So it's definitely likely that he could be on the move this offseason. It really just depends what's happening with Aaron Rodgers, but also Garrett Wilson, who I thought about having in this video, but the Jets would just be insane to choose Aaron Rodgers over Garrett Wilson, because like Garrett Wilson, apparently there was a rumor that if Aaron Rodgers is back, Garrett Wilson wants to get traded, and I think the Jets would be insane to choose Aaron Rodgers over Garrett Wilson because they're basically like 15 years apart in age. But I think Devonte Adams could definitely be on the market as well. He's still a solid wide receiver too, and I thought some teams that were interested in him at the deadline could definitely be interested for him in the offseason, because he'd probably go for less than what the Jets paid for at the trade deadline. And he did get off to a rough start with the Jets, but he had some really encouraging games to finish out this season. I think he could be a low-end wide receiver 1, high-end wide receiver 2 for a bunch of teams, and I don't think he would go for too much. So I think he could be on the move this offseason as well. Another receiver that could be on the move that probably wouldn't cost too much, and he almost got traded to the Steelers at the trade deadline, is Christian Kirk, who signed that massive 4-year, $72 million deal with the Jaguars a couple years ago and is going to be a free agent at the end of the 2025 season. He had another year where he was injured. He only appeared in 8 games this year for the Jaguars and 12 games last year. That first year, though, in 2022, when he signed that contract, he had 84 catches for 1,100 yards on the season. And I think just him still being 28 years old, it's basically a 1-year deal. There is a $24 million cap hit and a $13 million dead cap on Kirk's contract. It is definitely tradable. We've seen far bigger deals get moved in the past. I don't think he would go for much because they're all in on Brian Thomas Jr. and maybe Parker Washington and still Evan Ingram out there. They're going to have a new head coach this offseason, and I think they're just retooling this Jaguars team as a whole. He wouldn't go for too much just because he's been injured the last 2 years, and this is the last year of his deal. I could see Christian Kirk on the move. This player isn't as good as a defensive player as some of the edge rushers we've talked about, like Myles Garrett, Max Crosby, and TJ Watt, but he's in the last year of his deal. This team is looking to free up some money to re-sign T. Higgins. Could Sam Hubbard be on the move as well? Okay, Sam Hubbard did sign that 4-year, $40 million extension in 2021 with the Bengals. He is a free agent at the end of the 2025 season, like I said. $9 million base salary, $11 million cap hit, and just $2 million in dead cap. It would definitely be an easier contract to move. He just had 2 sacks this year throughout 14 games, but he's had every single year of his career outside of 2020 where he had 6 sacks or more. He's a former 3rd-round pick. He's 29 years old, and I think the Bengals could look to get a little bit younger on the defensive side of the field, and if you can get a nice day 2 pick for Sam Hubbard, you could definitely use that and get a cheaper edge rusher as well in a deep class. Another edge rusher that could be on the move this offseason as well, someone that's just been on a bunch of teams over the last couple of years of his career, and it's been around for a little bit now, since the 2014 draft where he was the #1 overall pick, Javon Clowny of the Carolina Panthers. And Clowny was coming off a very good year for Carolina. In 14 games, he had 5.5 sacks, 46 tackles, 11 QB hits, and 9 tackles for loss. He did sign a 2-year, $20 million contract with the Panthers last offseason, so it's got 1 year left on his deal. If the Panthers don't decide to cut him, they could free up a little bit of money doing that as well. They could look to keep him on board just to help out that defense for the 2025 season, and if they're not doing well, they could definitely trade him at the 2025 trade deadline, but they could definitely get something for him this offseason, as he's 32 years old, and I know he's from the Carolina area, but he may want to be part of a championship team, and this year it really didn't show like he was slowing down whatsoever, so he could be on the move this offseason as well. Probably one of the better veteran edge rushers on the market. All right, let's talk quarterbacks again. Could Gino Smith get traded this offseason from the Seattle Seahawks, who are kind of in limbo right now as well, because this team has underperformed, it seemed like, over the last few years? Gino did bring the Seahawks to a playoff appearance in that 2022 season, but they lost to San Fran, and that was more of a blowout loss as well. They didn't make the playoffs the last 2 years, going 8-7 last year with Gino as the starter. He missed some time, and then this year they ended up going 10-7. And Gino is still an above average quarterback in this league, in my opinion. He's coming off a year where he threw for 4,300 yards, 21 touchdowns. He did throw 15 interceptions, but he did have a completion percentage of 70%, one of the highest in the NFL. Gino is 34 years old, but he will be 34 years old throughout next year's season, and it's the last year of his current deal. He signed a 3-year, $75 million extension with the Seahawks back in 2023. He's got a cap hit of $44 million this year, just $13 million in dead cap. After this year, this Gino contract has become a lot more feasible to be traded, as he just has a base salary of $14.8 million. I know a lot of teams that would be lining up to trade for Gino Smith if he were to be made available by the Seattle Seahawks. And we got to talk about this player as well. It was the 10th overall pick in the 2024 draft. He is a quarterback, J.J. McCarthy of the Minnesota Vikings. Sam Darnold was an MVP candidate this year. Is he going to win that award? No, but he was a top 10 quarterback in the league this year with Kevin O'Connell, and they found something that works. At least it did throughout the regular season. So could they be looking to trade J.J. McCarthy if they would be getting a valuable pick in return? Because Sam Darnold is still just 27 years old. He's still incredibly young. You could say he's in his prime right now, and you may look to ink him up on a new extension. Now, if I were Minnesota, I would look to do that, but similar to that extension I talked about with Gino Smith before, maybe something like a 3-year, $75 million deal that becomes somewhat of an out after year 3, or an easier contract to trade, and you let J.J. McCarthy sit behind Gino Smith, something we saw with Jordan Love in Green Bay, even Patrick Mahomes for 1 year behind Alex Smith in Kansas City. J.J. McCarthy is still just 21 years old when I'm recording this. He's going to be 22 very soon, but he can definitely look to grow behind Sam Darnold, learn from him and Kevin O'Connell there in Minnesota. But if they think that they can get a first-round pick or a valuable pick for McCarthy and Sam Darnold is their guy going forward, could they look to entertain trade ideas for the former 10th overall pick? All right, I'm currently editing this video after the Monday night game between the Rams and the Vikings, and yeah, Sam Darnold definitely lost himself a ton of money that Monday night game, and it's looking like they're probably going to go in the direction of letting Sam Darnold potentially walk in free agency, and J.J. McCarthy or somebody else can be the bridge quarterback. So I would say that Monday night performance definitely hurt the chances of J.J. getting traded. It was not a good year for the New York Giants whatsoever, and it wasn't a good year either for the former 7th overall pick, Evan Neal, who I think could be somebody that could use a change of scenery this offseason, as Evan Neal was up and down this year, but the Giants right now are kind of in a weird retool, still a rebuild phase. They're trying to get their franchise quarterback this offseason, if that's going to be Cam Ward, Shedeur Sanders, or somebody else. He played all snaps this year at the right tackle position, and he does have 2 years left on his rookie contract because of that 5th-year option in 2026. So I talked about somebody else from the 2022 draft class getting moved earlier in Chris Olave. He could look for a change of scenery. That could be the same with Evan Neal in New York. 3 players left. We're going to talk about 3 wide receivers. The first one, Cooper Kupp in Los Angeles. There were some rumblings that he could get traded at this year's trade deadline, but then the Rams went on a winning streak and they ended up making the playoffs. Cooper Kupp is 31 years old, and he was definitely the wide receiver 2 this year to Puka Nacua when he was healthy. He's coming off a year where he had 100 targets, 67 catches for 710 yards. He did miss 5 games. Basically, since his Triple Crown season, he's missed 8 games in 2022, 5 games in 2023, and 5 games in 2024. He does have 2 years left on his deal. He's got a $12.5 million base salary this year, $14.8 million next year, $29 million cap hit in 2025, and $27 million cap hit in 2026. It becomes a little bit easier to trade after the 2025 season. But honestly, the Rams have done a great job, not just drafting in the first round over their last few drafts, but on day 2 and day 3. So Puka's obviously the wide receiver 1. They're still trying to figure out what life is going to be after Matthew Stafford. Maybe they could still get a valuable day 2 pick for Cooper Kupp, who's 31 years old and looks like he's maybe declining in his career, at least off that Triple Crown season. We saw him be one of the best receiving seasons of all time a few years ago. There's been some reports that this may not happen, but I think San Francisco has to think about it. I think they should definitely make Deebo Samuel available this offseason if they can get anything for him, because Deebo Samuel did not look like the player he has been in the past this season, where he had 51 catches, 670 yards, 3 touchdowns. Now he had pneumonia this season and injuries. So it's just kind of a disaster year for not just Deebo, but the whole San Francisco 49ers team as a whole, because Deebo was so versatile in that 2021 season, and then he dealt with some injuries in 2022, was still a productive player in 2023, but this year, with just basically everybody having an issue outside of Javon Jennings for the San Francisco 49ers offense, Deebo wasn't that good. He does have just a base salary of $1.1 million in the 2025 season, but he does have a cap hit of $15 million, and they'd absorb a $31 million dead cap if they were to trade him. And his contract is basically done at the end of this year, because he did sign a 3-year, $71 million extension in the 2022 season. Deebo's still 28 years old, and I still think has a lot left in the tank. It just may not be in San Fran, where they drafted Ricky Pearsall in the first round last year. They extended Javon Jennings, who looked very good this year, and they extended Brandon Ayuk before the season started as well. Now, maybe with all these injuries, it shows why depth is huge, but I think San Francisco could look to move Deebo, draft a wide receiver in day 2 or day 3, because they got that Brock Purdy extension coming up as well, and they need to save all the money they can. And the last player we're going to talk about, I think they shouldn't trade him, but there's been a lot of reports that this could happen, and that is DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. DK is 27 years old. He's coming off a season where he appeared in 15 games. He had 66 catches, 992 yards, but just 5 touchdowns on the year. Now, 3 of DK's 6 years, he's gone for over 1,000 yards. At times, he was the wide receiver 2 to Tyler Lockett. Then he became the wide receiver 1. And now it kind of looks like he's the wide receiver 2 to JSN there in Seattle. And DK is a free agent at the end of the 2025 season. So let's say the Seattle Seahawks front office and DK Metcalf are far apart on a deal. Maybe DK wants to be the highest paid receiver in the NFL, and the Seattle Seahawks don't want to do that. Could they look to entertain trade ideas for DK, who'd probably still go for maybe a first-round pick on the market since he's still in his prime? You would have to attach a contract extension on him, but maybe a change of scenery, DK can kind of reclaim his status as one of the best receivers in the NFL. So that is going to be for me. I hope you guys did enjoy this video. Let me know if you agree or disagree with any of the players I talked about down below. Drop a thumbs up if you guys did enjoy. And yeah, let me know down below as well any players that I didn't talk about that you think could get traded this offseason. And I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.